The streets of New York in the early 20th century were a chaotic symphony of ambition, desperation, and violence. Immigrant families crowded into tenements, chasing the fragile promise of the American dream, while beneath the surface, an invisible world thrived, one ruled not by law, but by fear, cunning, and the unspoken rules of the underworld. In the shadows of this city, where power was measured in influence and survival often depended on ruthlessness, a young man was quietly learning the ways of the street. His name was Lucky Luciano, and though the world outside the alleyways barely knew him yet, the whispers of his potential began to circulate among those who understood the currency of control. Luciano's story did not begin with grandeur or privilege. Born into a poor Italian immigrant family, he experienced early the harsh realities of urban life, overcrowding, hunger, and the constant threat of violence. His father's small grocery store was a fragile barrier against the chaos of the neighborhood, and it taught him lessons that would shape his understanding of people and power. Observing the interactions of neighbors, gangs, and local criminals, he began to grasp an essential truth: in this city, strength alone was not enough. Intelligence, strategy, and the ability to read people were equally vital. Even as a child, Luciano demonstrated a sharp mind and a fearless demeanor. He was not the type to shy away from confrontation, yet he understood the subtle art of negotiation, intimidation, and timing. These early lessons in social dynamics would become the foundation upon which he would build one of the most efficient criminal empires in history. The streets were his classroom, and the lessons were brutal. Every encounter, whether with petty thieves, rival gangs, or corrupt police officers, was a puzzle, a test of wit and nerve. The city itself seemed to pulse with the tension of conflicting worlds, the honest laborers striving for a better life, the immigrants trying to carve out a space in a hostile environment, and the criminals who thrived by exploiting both. It was within this tangled ecosystem that Luciano observed the limitations of brute force and the power of strategy. He saw how a well-placed word, a timely alliance, or the subtle manipulation of fear could yield far greater results than violence alone. The young Luciano internalized these lessons with a keen, almost ruthless, clarity, setting him apart from his peers. By the time he reached adolescence, his reputation had begun to spread through Little Italy. He was known not merely as a street fighter, but as a thinker, a boy who could anticipate his adversaries' moves, who understood the delicate balance between respect and intimidation. This duality, the combination of intellect and audacity, would define his approach to power. In a city where loyalty was fleeting and betrayal was common, Luciano learned to navigate alliances with precision, knowing when to trust, when to manipulate, and when to strike decisively. Even at this early stage, the forces that would shape his destiny were already at play. Rivalries, territorial disputes, and the allure of fast money presented constant challenges, while law enforcement oscillated between indifference and intervention, creating a precarious landscape. Within this environment, Luciano honed an instinct for survival that bordered on preternatural. He observed patterns, exploited weaknesses, and cultivated relationships that would later become the backbone of his empire. As the story of Lucky Luciano begins, it is essential to understand that his rise was not a product of chance, but of environment, intellect, and a profound understanding of human nature. The chaos of New York streets did not crush him, it taught him. Every alleyway confrontation, every tense negotiation, every fleeting encounter with power and violence was a lesson, a step in a journey that would ultimately reshape organized crime in America. The city that might have broken others instead forged him, preparing him for a life that would be as legendary as it was feared. By the late 1920s, when Prohibition had turned the city into a battleground of bootleggers and gang wars, Luciano had already begun to emerge from the shadows. He moved with a combination of discretion and daring, steadily building influence, making allies, and neutralizing rivals with a calculated hand. Those who underestimated him quickly learned that behind the unassuming young man was a mind capable of orchestrating strategies that others could scarcely imagine. The foundations of power, once laid on the harsh streets of Little Italy, were about to expand into an empire that would forever alter the landscape of organized crime. The streets of Little Italy were more than just cobblestones and tenements, they were a crucible that shaped character, forged ambition, and revealed the harsh realities of life for Italian immigrants in early 20th century New York. Families like the Lucianos lived crowded into small apartments, often with multiple generations under one roof, their daily existence defined by scarcity and struggle. Work was grueling and poorly paid, opportunities were limited, and every day demanded a careful negotiation with both circumstance and survival. For young Charles, Lucky, Luciano, this environment became a school unlike any other, one where lessons were taught not in classrooms, but in the alleyways, saloons, and street corners of his neighborhood. Luciano's father, a modest grocer, was a figure of stability amid the chaos. He embodied the values of hard work and persistence, but even his store was vulnerable to the pressures of the street, theft, intimidation, and the looming presence of local criminals. Watching his father navigate these dangers, Luciano began to recognize the subtle interplay between influence, respect, and fear. He noticed which neighbors could be persuaded, which rivals would respect strength, and how the threat of consequences often proved more effective than brute force. These early observations planted the seeds for a lifetime of strategy and calculated action. From a young age, Luciano was drawn to the rhythm of the streets, where every day brought a new challenge and every interaction held hidden significance. He watched older boys and men engage in fights, negotiations, and schemes, absorbing not just the mechanics of criminal activity, but the psychology that underpinned it. It was a world governed by unwritten rules, where reputation could mean the difference between survival and disaster. Luciano learned to read these signals with uncanny precision, recognizing the gestures, expressions, and subtleties that revealed a person's intentions and vulnerabilities. School offered little refuge or direction. Discipline was strict, resources were scarce, and education often took a backseat to the daily demands of life in the neighborhood. Yet, even in this limited setting, Luciano demonstrated a sharp intellect. He was curious, observant, and willing to test boundaries, a combination that both frustrated his teachers and drew the attention of those who saw potential in the streetwise boy. The lessons he learned outside the classroom, negotiation, perception, and timing, proved far more valuable in shaping his understanding of power than anything formal education could offer. The neighborhood itself was a microcosm of the immigrant struggle. Markets, docks, and factories provided employment, but they were also rife with exploitation, corruption, and danger. Young men often found themselves drawn into petty crime as a means of survival or advancement. For Luciano, it was not just about survival, it was about positioning himself for something greater. He observed the hierarchies within gangs, the flow of money, and the moments when loyalty could be demanded or manipulated. The streets were harsh, but they were also a proving ground, and Luciano thrived in this environment, learning the nuances of power, influence, and respect. Even childhood friendships were infused with competition and strategy. Alliances could shift in an instant, and betrayal was always a possibility. Luciano understood that to navigate this world successfully, one needed not only courage but foresight. He cultivated a reputation for fearlessness, but he also demonstrated an ability to weigh risks, to know when to act and when to wait. This duality, a combination of audacity and calculation, set him apart from peers who relied solely on aggression or instinct. Family, culture, and community played complex roles in shaping his psyche. The Italian immigrant identity was steeped in tradition, honor, and loyalty, yet the American urban landscape tested those ideals at every turn. Luciano internalized the lessons of his heritage while adapting them to a world that demanded pragmatism and shrewdness. Respect could be earned through strength or cunning, and fear could be wielded as effectively as affection. He learned to move fluidly between these modes, understanding that survival often required moral flexibility and an unflinching eye for opportunity. By his early teens, Luciano was already making a name for himself. Minor scrapes with the law, small-scale thefts, and confrontations with rival boys were not merely acts of delinquency, they were exercises in strategy, influence, and reputation building. The boy who had grown up navigating the tight corridors of tenements and the crowded streets of Little Italy was developing the instincts of a leader, someone who could command attention, anticipate threats, and manipulate circumstances to his advantage. The city around him was changing rapidly. Waves of immigrants, economic instability, and the coming of prohibition created both chaos and opportunity. Luciano observed the rise of organized crime as older, more established figures jockeyed for power, often through violence and intimidation. He saw how disorganized factions could be exploited and how a sharp mind could achieve dominance without the prolonged cost of constant conflict. The young man recognized that the future belonged not to those with the strongest fists, but to those with the clearest strategy. In this crucible of poverty, danger, and unrelenting challenge, lucky Luciano learned lessons that would carry him to the pinnacle of the criminal world. The streets of Little Italy were more than a backdrop, they were a teacher, a test, and a proving ground. Every encounter, every decision, and every narrow escape honed his instincts, sharpened his intellect, and forged a character capable of commanding both fear and respect. The city that might have crushed an ordinary boy instead molded a figure whose influence would one day extend far beyond the alleyways and tenements of his youth, leaving a legacy that continues to intrigue, terrify, and captivate generations. By the time Charles, lucky, Luciano entered his teenage years, the streets of Little Italy had already begun to shape him into more than just a streetwise boy, they were molding a strategist, a negotiator, and a young man whose instincts for power and influence were becoming sharper with each passing day. The chaotic environment of tenements, narrow alleyways, and bustling markets was his arena, and every confrontation, every encounter, was a lesson in human behavior. Luciano was no longer merely reacting to the world around him, he was learning to anticipate it, to manipulate circumstances to his advantage, and to understand that power was as much about perception as it was about action. Luciano's initiation into the criminal world was gradual but deliberate. It began with petty thefts, small-time hustles, and running errands for local gangsters who recognized the potential in the bright, audacious youth. Unlike many of his peers, Luciano approached each task with an analytical mind, observing the reactions of those around him, noting who commanded respect, who succumbed to fear, and how loyalty could be earned or exploited. Each errand, each small scheme, was more than a means to money, it was a lesson in human psychology and the mechanics of influence, and Luciano absorbed these lessons with an intensity that belied his years. The early 1920s were a pivotal period in New York's criminal underworld. Prohibition was transforming the city, turning ordinary citizens into consumers of illicit alcohol and creating immense opportunity for those willing to exploit it. Gangs were expanding their reach, rivalries were intensifying, and the lines between ambition and survival were increasingly blurred. In this turbulent landscape, Luciano's sharp intellect and calculated audacity allowed him to navigate dangers that would have crushed less astute individuals. He learned quickly that brute strength alone was insufficient, alliances, timing, and the careful management of reputation were the true currencies of power. Luciano's relationships with mentors and early associates played a crucial role in his development. Figures such as Frankie Yale and Johnny Torrio offered him both protection and education in the art of organized crime. From them, he learned the mechanics of running illegal enterprises, managing crews, and the importance of cultivating trust, and, when necessary, exploiting weaknesses. Yet even as he absorbed their teachings, Luciano was quietly reshaping them, introducing a sharper strategic sensibility and a willingness to challenge traditional hierarchies. Unlike many who were content to follow established patterns, he saw opportunities where others saw risk, and he began plotting moves that would elevate him above his contemporaries. One of Luciano's most significant assets was his ability to read people. He could sense ambition, fear, and loyalty with an almost instinctual precision. This skill allowed him to form alliances that others overlooked, to neutralize potential threats before they became dangerous, and to assert influence in ways that were subtle yet unmistakable. His rise was not simply the result of boldness or ruthlessness, it was the product of a mind attuned to the subtleties of human behavior, capable of manipulating perception to create advantage. Those who underestimated him often learned too late that he was always thinking several steps ahead. Luciano's ambition extended beyond mere survival or local notoriety. He sought control, efficiency, and order in a world dominated by chaos. Whereas older gangsters relied on fear and reputation, he understood the power of organization, planning, and calculated risk. He began envisioning a structure that could turn disorganized gangs into a coordinated network capable of generating unprecedented wealth and influence. This vision, though nascent, distinguished him from peers who were content with episodic victories or fleeting power. Luciano was playing a game that extended far beyond the immediate streets of Little Italy. Violence remained a tool in his arsenal, but Luciano wielded it with precision rather than impulse. Every act of intimidation, every confrontation, was calculated to maximize gain while minimizing unnecessary exposure. He understood that fear could be more effective than bullets if applied correctly, and he cultivated an aura of unpredictability that kept rivals and allies alike uncertain of his next move. It was this balance, courage tempered by strategy, audacity guided by foresight, that accelerated his rise and began to solidify his reputation as someone destined to dominate the underworld. By the mid-1920s, Luciano's influence had begun to extend beyond his immediate circle. He was recognized not only as a rising power within Little Italy but also as a figure with the vision and capability to impact the broader criminal landscape of New York. His early successes in petty rackets, his ability to broker alliances, and his growing reputation for strategic brilliance positioned him uniquely as the next generation of mafia leadership. Those around him sensed it even if they could not yet fully comprehend the scope of his ambition. This period of his life also marked a critical psychological evolution. The boy who had grown up navigating tenement life and street violence was developing the mindset of a leader. He learned to suppress impulsive anger, to read subtle social cues, and to make decisions that would yield long-term advantage rather than immediate satisfaction. These traits, combined with his natural charisma and fearlessness, allowed him to command respect and loyalty, not simply through intimidation, but through calculated influence and demonstration of competence. The rise of Lucky Luciano as a young mobster was as much about his internal development as it was about external actions. He was building the foundation of a criminal philosophy, a system where strategy, foresight, and manipulation of human behavior were paramount. The streets of New York, with their constant threats and opportunities, had provided the perfect environment for honing these skills. By the end of this period, Luciano was no longer merely a street kid, he was a strategist in motion, a mind preparing to redefine organized crime in a way that would leave an indelible mark on the city and, eventually, the world. From the chaotic, blood-stained streets of Little Italy to the boardrooms of shadowy criminal networks, Lucky Luciano's transformation from a streetwise adolescent to the architect of the modern mafia was as much about vision as it was about audacity. By the late 1920s, he had already established himself as a force to be reckoned with, but what set him apart from his contemporaries was his understanding that real power was built not on violence alone, but on organization, efficiency, and the careful orchestration of human behavior. He recognized that the old ways of mob leadership, driven by brute strength, loyalty to family lines, and episodic dominance, were limited. To truly control New York's underworld, he would need to rethink the structure entirely, transforming crime into a disciplined, profit-driven enterprise. Luciano's first step was consolidating power among the fractured gangs of the city. Rival factions were constantly vying for territory, resources, and influence, often engaging in bloody, costly conflicts that weakened all sides. Luciano saw that the continuous cycle of violence was inefficient, it drained manpower, attracted law enforcement attention, and ultimately reduced profit margins. His approach was methodical: identify the strongest players, assess their strengths and weaknesses, and forge alliances that would both neutralize threats and maximize control. He understood that loyalty could be cultivated through incentives as much as intimidation, and that fear was a tool best applied sparingly, like a scalpel rather than a sledgehammer. At the core of his strategy was the concept of hierarchy and specialization. Luciano introduced a level of structure that the American mafia had never seen before. He organized crews and territories with clear lines of authority, assigning trusted lieutenants to oversee specific operations while maintaining ultimate oversight. This decentralization allowed the organization to operate efficiently, ensuring that no single conflict could destabilize the entire network. Each member had a role, each action had a purpose, and each decision contributed to the broader goal of profitability and stability. It was a business model disguised as crime, and it worked with terrifying effectiveness. Alliances were carefully cultivated not only for operational efficiency but also for political leverage. Luciano was adept at identifying individuals whose loyalty could be guaranteed through a combination of respect, mutual benefit, and subtle intimidation. Figures such as Meyer Lansky, with his financial acumen, and Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, with his audacity and connections, became indispensable partners. Luciano's genius lay in recognizing complementary skills and harnessing them to strengthen his empire, creating a network where individual ambition served collective power rather than undermining it. Through this, he began to replace the chaotic, personality-driven gang system with a coordinated organization that functioned like a well-oiled corporation. A critical component of Luciano's vision was the management of risk. He understood that law enforcement and federal authorities were inevitable obstacles, and that operations could not rely solely on secrecy or intimidation. He introduced measures to minimize exposure, such as compartmentalizing information, ensuring that only trusted lieutenants knew critical operational details, and establishing multiple streams of revenue that could withstand disruptions in any one area. The mafia under Luciano became not just a criminal network, but a resilient, adaptive system capable of weathering both internal and external shocks. Luciano also pioneered the idea of centralized decision-making through councils and meetings that brought rival factions together under a single framework. By establishing forums for negotiation and arbitration, he reduced intergang violence while simultaneously positioning himself as the ultimate arbiter of disputes. This was revolutionary in a landscape where personal vendettas often dictated action. By framing himself as both mediator and authority, Luciano enhanced his reputation, commanded loyalty, and subtly reinforced the perception that resistance was futile. The psychological impact of this approach was as significant as its practical effect, embedding a culture of compliance and respect across New York's criminal underworld. Profit maximization became another cornerstone of Luciano's empire. He diversified operations, controlling not just bootlegging and gambling but also labor racketeering, loan sharking, and illicit entertainment ventures. Each enterprise was treated as a business unit, with clear oversight, accountability, and strategic objectives. Luciano monitored these operations closely, ensuring that inefficiency, corruption, or betrayal were swiftly addressed. By professionalizing crime in this way, he increased revenue, minimized internal conflicts, and cemented his image as a visionary leader whose influence extended far beyond his immediate sphere. Perhaps most revolutionary was Luciano's approach to succession and continuity. Unlike older mafia bosses, who relied heavily on familial ties or personal charisma, Luciano emphasized merit, competence, and strategic thinking. He groomed lieutenants who could operate independently while adhering to the principles he had established, ensuring that the organization would endure even in the event of his removal or incarceration. This forward-thinking approach transformed the mafia from a collection of volatile, personality-driven gangs into a durable institution with long-term sustainability. The consolidation of power also involved calculated acts of violence, but these were measured and strategic rather than impulsive. Eliminating rivals, intimidating defectors, and enforcing discipline within his own ranks were all part of the larger objective: stability, profitability, and control. Luciano's reputation for decisive action grew alongside his empire, reinforcing the perception that while he preferred negotiation and organization, he would not hesitate to employ lethal force when necessary. This balance of diplomacy and violence became a hallmark of his leadership style, creating an aura of fear, respect, and inevitability. By the end of this period, Luciano had transformed the landscape of organized crime in New York. What had once been a fragmented collection of street gangs was now a cohesive network under his command, operating with the efficiency and precision of a corporate enterprise. The foundations he laid, hierarchy, specialization, centralized decision-making, risk management, and strategic violence, became the blueprint for modern organized crime, not only in New York but across the United States. Luciano had achieved more than dominance. He had engineered a system that could endure beyond any individual, ensuring that his influence would persist long after he himself was gone. In the eyes of the public, Luciano was still a shadowy figure, a name whispered in fear and fascination. But within the underworld, he had become something far greater, a strategist, an innovator, and a leader whose vision redefined power. The empire he was building was not merely about money or control, it was a demonstration of his intellect, his psychological acuity, and his understanding of the mechanisms of human behavior. Luciano's genius lay in his ability to combine audacity with foresight, fear with respect, and crime with business acumen, qualities that would ensure his place as one of the most formidable figures in American history. By the late 1920s, Lucky Luciano had not only established himself as a formidable figure in New York's criminal underworld but had also begun to master the intricate dance of alliances and rivalries that would define his reign. Power in the mafia was never absolute, it was a constantly shifting landscape where loyalty could be bought, sold, or betrayed, and where one misstep could result in violent retribution. Luciano understood this implicitly. He recognized that to secure his dominance, he could not rely solely on fear or brute force, he needed allies who were as ambitious and calculating as he was, as well as rivals whose respect he could command or neutralize with precision. The art of balancing these relationships became central to his strategy. Key figures emerged as both pillars and potential threats in Luciano's ascent. Meyer Lansky, with his unparalleled financial insight and unshakable composure, was more than a partner, he was an intellectual complement, someone who could see patterns in profit and risk that others could not. Benjamin Bugsy Siegel brought audacity and charisma, the kind of reckless brilliance that, when guided, became a formidable tool in Luciano's arsenal. These men were not mere subordinates, they were collaborators, co-conspirators in the creation of a criminal enterprise that was organized, disciplined, and ruthlessly efficient. Together, they formed a network that blended brains, brawn, and vision, each member contributing unique skills to the consolidation of power. Yet alliances in this world were never guaranteed. Luciano's rise coincided with the fractious landscape of New York's mafia, where older, entrenched bosses still clung to tradition, and rival factions were constantly scheming to undermine one another. Figures such as Joe Masuria and Salvatore Maranzano represented both opportunity and peril. Aligning with them could provide legitimacy and access to resources, but it also carried immense risk. Luciano navigated these relationships with a combination of charm, strategic calculation, and a willingness to strike decisively when necessary. His genius lay in his ability to maintain the appearance of loyalty and cooperation while simultaneously advancing his own agenda. Betrayal was a constant specter, and Luciano learned early that trust was a commodity to be measured, rationed, and exploited. He observed the weaknesses in human nature, greed, ambition, pride, and used them to his advantage. A well-timed alliance could pacify a potential threat, while a calculated betrayal could remove a rival from the chessboard entirely. The young mobster understood that relationships in the underworld were transactional, loyalty had value only insofar as it served the larger objectives of power and security. By mastering this dynamic, he positioned himself as both indispensable and untouchable. The stakes were amplified by the volatile environment of Prohibition-era New York. Bootlegging, gambling, and prostitution rackets had created vast fortunes and, with them, intense competition. Rival gangs fought not only for territory but for control of resources that could make or break an empire. Luciano's strategic acumen allowed him to anticipate moves before they occurred, to broker deals that others overlooked, and to manipulate outcomes in his favor. Even as alliances were formed, he remained vigilant, always calculating the balance of power, always prepared to pivot when circumstances shifted. Negotiation was as vital as intimidation. Luciano excelled at creating arrangements that benefited multiple parties while ensuring his dominance remained unchallenged. He understood that human psychology was a powerful tool, men were motivated not only by money but by respect, fear, and the desire for recognition. By appealing to these drivers, he could forge partnerships that appeared mutually beneficial, yet always tilted in his favor. This subtle manipulation of perception and incentive allowed him to expand influence without constantly resorting to violence, a hallmark of his strategic sophistication. Internal loyalty within his own ranks was equally critical. Luciano cultivated a core group of trusted lieutenants, men whose skills and temperament complemented his own. These relationships were carefully nurtured, tested, and occasionally reinforced through acts that demonstrated both generosity and ruthlessness. Those who proved themselves were rewarded with authority and wealth, those who faltered faced consequences that reinforced the structure of power. In this way, Luciano created not merely followers, but invested partners who internalized the values and priorities of his emerging empire. Conflict, however, was unavoidable. As Luciano's influence grew, so too did envy and resentment. Competitors both within and outside his immediate circle sought to challenge his authority, testing the limits of his alliances. Each confrontation required a delicate balance of strategy and assertiveness. Sometimes intimidation was sufficient, other times a decisive strike was necessary to maintain credibility. Luciano's approach was always measured, designed to achieve maximum effect with minimal exposure. He understood that the perception of control was often as important as control itself, and he wielded both with precision. The psychological complexity of these relationships cannot be overstated. Luciano's genius was in his ability to simultaneously inspire loyalty, instill fear, and manipulate perception. Allies believed in him, competitors respected or feared him, and even those who plotted against him were compelled to consider his moves carefully before acting. By managing this intricate web of human behavior, he created a dynamic in which his authority seemed both inevitable and inescapable. By the end of this formative period, Luciano's network was vast and robust, composed of men whose ambitions aligned with his own and whose capabilities enhanced the overall strength of the organization. He had mastered the delicate art of balancing alliances and rivalries, turning potential threats into assets and creating a structure in which loyalty was incentivized, betrayal was punished, and power was centralized yet flexible. In doing so, he cemented his reputation as a strategist capable of navigating the most treacherous waters of human ambition, a man whose influence extended far beyond the streets where his journey had begun. The stage was set for what would become the most ambitious restructuring of organized crime in American history. Luciano had proven that true leadership in the underworld required more than fear or violence, it required intellect, foresight, and an almost surgical understanding of human psychology. His rise was not simply the accumulation of wealth or territory but the establishment of a system in which he could anticipate, manipulate, and dominate. Through alliances, rivalries, and carefully calculated betrayals, Luciano transformed himself from a street-level operator into a figure whose reach and reputation would soon become legendary. The mafia of Lucky Luciano's era was governed by a code that was as invisible as it was unbreakable, a set of principles that dictated behavior, loyalty, and survival. This code, known as omerta, was the heartbeat of organized crime, a psychological framework that bound men together through fear, honor, and mutual dependence. For Luciano, understanding and mastering this code was not merely a matter of tradition, it was a tool, a weapon, and a means of consolidating control over an empire that thrived on secrecy and obedience. Loyalty was demanded, respect was earned, and betrayal carried consequences that were swift and absolute. To navigate this world successfully, one had to internalize these principles and wield them with a mixture of reverence, cunning, and pragmatism. Omerta was, at its core, a system of psychological control. It required silence above all else, a strict prohibition against sharing the inner workings of the organization with outsiders. Breaking this code could result in ostracism, retribution, or death. Luciano understood that the true power of omerta lay not merely in the threat of punishment, but in its ability to shape behavior preemptively. Men internalized the rules, policing themselves out of fear, respect, or the desire for acceptance. By reinforcing this structure, Luciano could maintain order and discipline within his ranks without the constant need for overt enforcement. The mere existence of the code created a culture in which trust was sacred, and treachery was unthinkable, at least publicly. Yet omerta was more than silence, it was a complex system of loyalty and hierarchy. It demanded allegiance to the organization above all else, requiring members to subordinate personal ambition or familial obligation when these conflicted with the interests of the group. Luciano exploited this principle masterfully. He knew that loyalty could be incentivized through power, wealth, and status, and he used these rewards strategically to bind his lieutenants and allies to him. Simultaneously, he cultivated an environment in which disloyalty was not only dangerous but socially and morally repugnant, creating an internalized fear that kept potential defectors in line before any action was necessary. Fear, in Luciano's hands, was not indiscriminate, it was precise and calibrated. He understood that terror could be a blunt instrument, effective in moments of crisis but corrosive if overused. True control required a balance of intimidation and respect, a recognition that men were more pliable when they believed in the inevitability of consequences rather than the caprice of punishment. Luciano's reputation for decisiveness, coupled with his ability to reward loyalty generously, created an equilibrium in which men were motivated to serve him faithfully, not merely out of fear, but out of calculated self-interest. In this sense, Omerta became both a moral code and a strategic tool, one that extended beyond rules into the realm of human psychology. The enforcement of this code also served to reinforce Luciano's authority. By holding men accountable to Omerta, he positioned himself as the ultimate arbiter of morality and power within the organization. Decisions regarding discipline, retribution, and reward were not arbitrary, they were framed as adherence to a higher principle. This allowed Luciano to wield influence without appearing tyrannical, reinforcing his legitimacy while maintaining an aura of inevitability around his leadership. Men came to see him not only as a figure of power but as the custodian of the values that underpinned their collective enterprise. Omerta also extended into the broader criminal ecosystem, shaping relationships between rival families, associates, and external actors. Negotiations, disputes, and alliances were all conducted within the unspoken framework of this code, creating predictability in an otherwise chaotic environment. Luciano understood that the credibility of the code depended on consistent enforcement, promises had to be kept, threats had to be acted upon, and transgressions had to be punished. In doing so, he created a culture of accountability that reinforced both the stability and the reach of his empire. The psychological implications of Omerta were profound. Men internalized the code not only out of fear of punishment but also because it conferred a sense of belonging, identity, and purpose. Loyalty was intertwined with honor, and adherence to the code became a marker of personal and professional integrity within the organization. Luciano leveraged this duality, ensuring that his influence was reinforced both externally through authority and internally through the values that guided his men. By aligning personal ambition with organizational rules, he created a self-sustaining system in which obedience became instinctive and defection increasingly rare. In practical terms, the code allowed Luciano to orchestrate complex operations with remarkable efficiency. Members could be trusted to execute plans with discretion, knowing that the consequences for betrayal were severe and inevitable. This trust enabled multi-layered schemes, coordinated raids, and expansive business ventures that would have been impossible in a less disciplined environment. Luciano's ability to combine psychological insight with operational control allowed him to expand his empire rapidly, while maintaining a level of cohesion and loyalty that often seemed miraculous in a world defined by treachery. Yet the power of Omerta was not absolute. Luciano understood that even the strongest code could be undermined by personal ambition, greed, or desperation. He maintained vigilance, monitoring his associates, testing their loyalty, and managing potential threats before they escalated. In some cases, subtle manipulation or calculated pressure was enough to realign behavior, while in others, swift and decisive action was required. The combination of moral authority, strategic enforcement, and psychological acuity ensured that Luciano remained firmly in control, even as the stakes grew ever higher. Ultimately, the Code of Omerta under Luciano was more than tradition, it was a mechanism of power, a psychological framework that allowed him to govern an empire as vast and volatile as the New York underworld. It demanded respect, enforced discipline, and cultivated loyalty, all while providing Luciano with the leverage to expand his influence without the need for constant overt force. By mastering this code, he demonstrated that true power in the criminal world was not derived solely from violence, wealth, or intimidation, it was cultivated through understanding, manipulation, and the ability to align human behavior with the strategic goals of leadership. Through Omerta, Luciano created an organization that was disciplined, resilient, and adaptive. Men followed him not only because they feared the consequences of betrayal, but because they recognized the intelligence, foresight, and authority that he embodied. In mastering this delicate balance of loyalty, fear, and respect, Luciano not only secured his dominance over the streets of New York but also laid the psychological and operational foundations for a criminal empire that would endure for generations. The era of Prohibition transformed New York City into a landscape of opportunity, chaos, and unbridled ambition. For many, it was a time of illicit indulgence and fleeting fortune, but for lucky Luciano, it was the perfect storm, a chance to expand his influence, consolidate power, and turn criminal enterprise into a structured, profitable system. The ban on alcohol created an insatiable demand that fueled underground economies, turning ordinary streets into battlegrounds for control over bootlegging, speakeasies, and the complex web of suppliers, distributors, and enforcers. Where others saw risk and violence, Luciano saw strategy, organization, and opportunity. Bootlegging became the backbone of his empire. Luciano understood that control over the distribution of illegal liquor meant not just profit, but leverage. He cultivated relationships with suppliers, negotiated deals with other gangs, and ensured that his operations were both efficient and insulated from law enforcement whenever possible. These networks were sophisticated, involving multiple layers of oversight and compartmentalization. Trusted lieutenants managed individual segments, allowing the enterprise to operate like a corporation rather than a collection of loosely affiliated street crews. By systematizing the flow of alcohol from shipment to sale, Luciano maximized revenue while minimizing exposure to risk, demonstrating his genius for turning illegal activity into a structured, business-like operation. Gambling operations were another pillar of Luciano's empire. While small-time bookmaking had always existed, he expanded it into a coordinated system that spanned the city, incorporating both underground casinos and clandestine betting rings. Here, too, the emphasis was on organization and oversight. By establishing trusted managers, enforcing strict rules, and leveraging connections in law enforcement and politics, Luciano created a gambling network that was not only profitable but remarkably resilient. Players, enforcers, and operators all had defined roles, and the flow of money was carefully monitored. This attention to detail allowed Luciano to maintain a steady stream of income even as authorities attempted crackdowns, highlighting the sophistication and adaptability of his approach. Prostitution rackets, while morally controversial, were another area where Luciano demonstrated strategic brilliance. Unlike the disorganized and often violent systems run by older gangs, he implemented a model that emphasized control, discretion, and revenue optimization. Brothels and escort services were managed with precision, overseen by trusted lieutenants who reported directly to him. He ensured that workers, managers, and customers were all incentivized to maintain secrecy and order, thereby minimizing law enforcement scrutiny while maximizing profits. This approach reflected a consistent principle, that every enterprise, no matter how morally questionable, could be transformed into a controlled, efficient, and lucrative operation under the right leadership. Labor racketeering was perhaps one of Luciano's most ingenious moves. By infiltrating unions and exploiting the leverage they held over industries, he was able to extract significant profits while exerting indirect influence over entire sectors of the city's economy. Strikes, threats, and negotiations became tools for both control and enrichment, allowing Luciano to expand his empire into areas far beyond traditional criminal activity. This blending of legitimate labor influence with illicit strategy exemplified his ability to think several steps ahead, to identify opportunity where others saw chaos, and to consolidate power in innovative ways. The scale of Luciano's operations required not only meticulous planning but also sophisticated financial oversight. Money laundering, bookkeeping, and the careful management of profits ensured that the empire could grow without attracting undue attention. Luciano cultivated an understanding of finance and human behavior simultaneously, recognizing that discipline, accountability, and psychological leverage were equally important in sustaining his criminal ventures. Through careful oversight, he created a system in which even ambitious or potentially treacherous lieutenants found that loyalty and cooperation were more rewarding than defection. Collaboration with allies beyond his immediate circle also played a crucial role. Luciano was adept at negotiating deals with rival factions, transforming potential conflicts into mutually beneficial arrangements. He leveraged his reputation for both fairness and ruthlessness to secure agreements that expanded his reach without sparking unnecessary violence. Through these alliances, he ensured access to new territories, diversified revenue streams, and greater influence over the criminal landscape. His network became a complex web of interdependent relationships, each designed to reinforce his dominance while minimizing exposure to risk. Violence remained a tool, but one wielded with precision rather than abandon. Assassinations, beatings, and threats were employed strategically to enforce discipline, eliminate competition, and send clear messages to rivals. Luciano understood that uncontrolled violence attracted attention, increased risk, and could destabilize profitable operations. By selectively applying force, he maintained both fear and respect, reinforcing his authority without undermining the efficiency of his enterprise. The combination of calculated intimidation and strategic negotiation became a hallmark of his approach, allowing him to operate at a scale and efficiency unmatched by his contemporaries. Luciano's genius also lay in his ability to anticipate and adapt to shifting conditions. Law enforcement strategies, political changes, and rival ambitions were all variables he accounted for in his planning. He built redundancies into his operations, created contingency plans, and ensured that no single disruption could threaten the overall stability of his empire. This forward-thinking mindset transformed what could have been chaotic, opportunistic ventures into a durable, resilient system capable of generating wealth, influence, and long-term security. By the early 1930s, Luciano's name had become synonymous not only with power but with innovation. He had turned crime into a systematized enterprise, demonstrating that intelligence, planning, and psychological acuity could achieve dominance far beyond what raw violence alone could accomplish. His bootlegging, gambling, prostitution, and labor operations were more than revenue streams, they were instruments of control, instruments that allowed him to shape the environment, manage alliances, and project authority across the city. Ultimately, the business of crime under Lucky Luciano was a reflection of his intellect, vision, and understanding of human nature. He proved that organized crime could be disciplined, efficient, and strategic, and in doing so, he laid the foundations for a model that would be emulated for decades. Every illicit enterprise was carefully calibrated, every alliance strategically managed, and every operation executed with a level of sophistication that elevated him above the chaotic violence of his predecessors. Through these ventures, Luciano did more than accumulate wealth, he transformed the very structure of organized crime, leaving a legacy of strategy, discipline, and innovation that would define his reign and influence generations to come. By the late 1920s and early 1930s, New York's criminal underworld was teetering on the edge of chaos. The Castellammarese War, a bloody conflict between rival mafia factions, had engulfed the city, threatening to dismantle the fragile structures of organized crime that Luciano and his allies were painstakingly building. On one side stood Joe Masuria, the old guard boss representing tradition, hierarchy, and an iron-fisted approach to leadership. On the other, Salvatore Maranzano, a rival seeking to consolidate power under the guise of Sicilian codes and family loyalty. The war was brutal, a deadly chessboard where every move carried consequences of blood and betrayal. For Luciano, it was both a challenge and an opportunity, a proving ground for the cunning, strategic mind that would soon redefine the mafia itself. The violence of the Castellammarese War was unprecedented. Streets became battlefields, speakeasies became ambush points, and even seemingly loyal associates were not immune to sudden executions. The conflict was rooted in territorial disputes, control over lucrative rackets, and the clash between old-world Sicilian traditions and the emerging Americanized vision of organized crime. Masuria demanded unquestioned obedience and brutal enforcement, while Maranzano relied on strict adherence to Sicilian codes and family hierarchies. Amid this turmoil, Luciano observed the inefficiencies, vulnerabilities, and rigidities of both camps, seeing opportunities that others could not perceive. Luciano's genius lay in his ability to navigate this maelstrom with a combination of cunning, diplomacy, and calculated aggression. Unlike many of his contemporaries, he did not align blindly with one faction. Instead, he positioned himself as a pivot point, cultivating relationships and maintaining influence across both sides. This allowed him to gather intelligence, manipulate perceptions, and exploit rivalries to his advantage. By remaining adaptable, he avoided the immediate dangers that claimed the lives of countless others while gradually consolidating leverage that would allow him to dictate outcomes. Trust and betrayal were central to this period. Luciano knew that loyalty in wartime was both precious and precarious. He orchestrated alliances that were temporary yet mutually beneficial, ensuring that each faction had reason to tolerate his position while he quietly advanced his own agenda. He cultivated a cadre of lieutenants who could execute his plans with precision, blending intimidation, negotiation, and subtle manipulation to turn potential threats into instruments of power. Every encounter, every conversation, and every transaction was calculated to strengthen his hand while keeping enemies uncertain of his ultimate intentions. The war also highlighted the strategic limitations of traditional mafia leadership. Masuria relied on brute force, instilling obedience through fear and demanding unquestioning loyalty. Maranzano, though disciplined and cunning, adhered rigidly to old-world Sicilian customs that limited flexibility and adaptability. Luciano recognized that both approaches were inherently flawed in a rapidly evolving underworld dominated by ambition, opportunity, and systemic complexity. His vision of organized crime, structured, profit-driven, and psychologically sophisticated, required a new kind of leadership, one that could manipulate perception, incentivize loyalty, and enforce consequences with precision rather than chaos. Luciano's tactical brilliance became evident in how he orchestrated the elimination of rivals while minimizing risk to himself. He used intermediaries, leverage, and careful timing to execute strikes that removed threats decisively. Each act of violence was not impulsive but calculated, designed to send a message to allies and enemies alike. By managing these operations with such precision, he demonstrated that power could be exercised with efficiency and foresight, in stark contrast to the reckless bloodshed that characterized much of the war. Psychologically, the Castellamarese War was a crucible. It tested loyalty, courage, and intellect, and Luciano thrived under this pressure. He understood the fears, ambitions, and insecurities of those around him, using this insight to manipulate outcomes in his favor. Allies were reassured, enemies were destabilized, and the perception of inevitability began to solidify around him. By the time the dust settled, Luciano had not only survived where others had fallen, but he had positioned himself as the undisputed arbiter of power, the strategist who had outmaneuvered both Masuria and Maranzano. The elimination of Joe Masuria in 1931 marked a turning point. Luciano had orchestrated a coup that was as elegant as it was ruthless, removing the old guard boss and seizing the initiative in the restructuring of the mafia. Maranzano's brief ascendance was similarly curtailed, as Luciano recognized that a return to rigid, hierarchical Sicilian structures would undermine the efficiency and profitability of his vision. In both cases, he leveraged violence strategically, ensuring that the removal of rivals served not only to consolidate power but to legitimize his new system. This period also emphasized the interplay of perception, loyalty, and fear. Luciano's ability to project inevitability, that he was the mastermind behind outcomes and that resistance was futile, was crucial to his success. Men followed him not merely because they feared reprisal but because they recognized his intellect, foresight, and capacity to deliver results. The psychological dominance he established during the Castellamarese War would become a hallmark of his leadership, underpinning the loyalty and efficiency of his organization for years to come. By the end of the war, the foundations were laid for the modern American mafia. Luciano had demonstrated that power was not an accident of violence, lineage, or tradition, but the result of strategy, organization, and psychological insight. He had transformed a city embroiled in bloody conflict into a disciplined network capable of coordinated operations, profit maximization, and enduring influence. The lessons learned during these years, about loyalty, manipulation, timing, and the use of force, became central tenets of his leadership philosophy. The Castellamarese War was more than a battle for territory, it was a crucible that tested every aspect of Luciano's intellect, strategy, and psychological acumen. By emerging as the victor, he not only consolidated power but also demonstrated the principles that would define his era: discipline over chaos, strategy over brute force, and influence through calculated manipulation of human behavior. The underworld had been forever transformed, and Lucky Luciano stood at its apex, a figure whose name commanded both respect and fear, and whose methods would set the blueprint for organized crime in America for decades to come. The ascent of Lucky Luciano, though meteoric and meticulously calculated, was never immune to the hazards inherent in a life built on illegality and intrigue. By the mid-1930s, his empire was vast, lucrative, and strategically organized, but it had also attracted the intense scrutiny of law enforcement, political figures, and rival factions who were eager to exploit any weakness. For all his brilliance, Luciano was acutely aware that the same structures that made him powerful, intricate networks of associates, expansive revenue streams, and high-profile influence, also made him vulnerable. The seeds of his downfall were sown not in the chaos of the streets, but in the very mechanisms that had allowed him to rise so quickly: visibility, ambition, and the fragile loyalty of those around him. Luciano's arrest in 1936 was the culmination of a carefully orchestrated federal investigation into his operations, centering primarily on his control over prostitution rings, labor racketeering, and gambling enterprises. Law enforcement had been gathering evidence for years, tracking patterns, building networks of informants, and analyzing financial flows. What made Luciano particularly vulnerable was the audacity with which he operated. His high-profile alliances, sophisticated management of operations, and visibility within the underworld drew attention from authorities who had grown increasingly frustrated with the systemic corruption that enabled organized crime. In the eyes of the law, Luciano was no longer a streetwise operator; he had become a symbol of an entrenched criminal empire that demanded dismantling. The arrest itself was both a shock and a calculated blow to his operations. Luciano, despite his brilliance, had underestimated the extent to which law enforcement and federal agencies were willing to go to bring him to justice. Surveillance, wiretaps, and informant testimonies converged, creating a web of evidence that left him little room for maneuver. The moment of arrest was both a psychological and practical turning point, a stark reminder that the power he wielded, while formidable, was not invincible. This event marked the beginning of a series of challenges that would test his strategic acumen in ways the streets had never done. Betrayal emerged as a critical factor in this period. The very network that had enabled Luciano to consolidate power also contained latent threats: associates whose loyalty was conditional, enforcers whose ambitions could be leveraged, and rivals waiting for an opportunity to strike. Some informants, motivated by personal gain or coerced by the authorities, provided the necessary testimonies to secure his arrest. Others within his organization may have calculated that distancing themselves from Luciano would protect their own interests. The dynamics of betrayal were subtle yet devastating. They revealed the fragility of trust within even the most disciplined criminal networks and underscored the inherent risk of a life built on clandestine operations and shifting allegiances. The psychological impact of his arrest was profound. Luciano, accustomed to being the orchestrator, the manipulator, and the ultimate arbiter of loyalty and fear, was suddenly subject to forces beyond his control. The streets where he once commanded unquestioned respect now seemed perilous in a new way. Law enforcement, courts, and media scrutiny replaced the familiar calculus of rival gangsters. He faced the realization that while he had mastered the art of controlling men, he could not control every variable in a society increasingly mobilized against organized crime. The arrest was a humbling and dangerous juncture, forcing him to reassess strategy, anticipate new threats, and navigate a world where his influence was suddenly constrained. The public spectacle surrounding his arrest amplified its significance. Newspapers sensationalized the capture, portraying Luciano as both villain and mastermind, a symbol of the mafia's reach and audacity. Media coverage created pressure not only on the legal system but also on his organization, introducing an additional layer of complexity to managing loyalty and perception. Associates, allies, and rivals alike were forced to recalibrate their positions, weighing the risks of remaining aligned with a man now in the grip of the law. This environment of uncertainty was one of the most dangerous Luciano had faced, testing both his psychological resilience and strategic foresight. Despite the initial shock, Luciano began to employ the same tactical thinking that had characterized his rise. He relied on his inner circle to maintain operations, manage alliances, and protect key interests. Delegation became crucial. He could no longer act personally, but his influence had to remain palpable. He carefully orchestrated communications, monitored developments, and continued to manipulate perception to ensure that his empire remained functional, even under the shadow of incarceration. This period demonstrated that Luciano's genius was not limited to street-level operations but extended to managing complex organizational systems under extreme pressure. The beginning of his downfall also exposed vulnerabilities that had previously been masked by his control. Rival factions sensed opportunity, law enforcement intensified pressure, and internal loyalty was tested as uncertainty grew. Even the most disciplined members of his organization had to reconcile the risk of association with the potential rewards of continued allegiance. Luciano's ability to navigate these dynamics, maintain authority, and plan for contingencies became critical in mitigating immediate losses while preparing for long-term survival. Ultimately, the fall that began with Luciano's arrest was not abrupt. It was a gradual erosion of invulnerability, a complex interplay of law, betrayal, and exposure. His strategic brilliance allowed him to maintain influence despite these pressures, but the arrest marked the start of a new chapter, one in which he was no longer the uncontested master of his environment, but a figure navigating the precarious balance between survival, control, and reputation. It was a period that would test every lesson he had learned about loyalty, fear, and human behavior, and it set the stage for the dramatic legal battles, negotiations, and manipulations that would define the next phase of his life. In this crucible of arrest and betrayal, Luciano's character and methods were revealed in sharp relief. The same mind that had orchestrated empires, manipulated allies, and outmaneuvered rivals now faced a system of justice designed to strip him of power. How he responded, with calculation, foresight, and a relentless drive to protect both his empire and his legacy, would become a testament to the enduring combination of intelligence, audacity, and psychological mastery that had always defined him. The fall had begun, but it was far from complete, and even in the shadow of imprisonment, Luciano remained a figure whose influence and reputation would not easily be diminished. The trial of Lucky Luciano in 1936 was more than a legal proceeding. It was a spectacle that captured the imagination of a nation and exposed the inner workings of organized crime to the public in unprecedented detail. Newspapers heralded it as the trial of the century, painting Luciano alternately as a cold-blooded mastermind, a cunning strategist, and a symbol of the insidious reach of the mafia. The courtroom became a stage where power, fear, and reputation were on display, and where the battle for control extended beyond the streets of New York into the public and moral consciousness of America. For Luciano, the trial was both a personal and strategic crucible, a moment that would define his legacy and test his ability to navigate the treacherous interplay of law, media, and human psychology. From the outset, the prosecution sought to portray Luciano as the puppet master of a vast criminal enterprise, responsible for a network of prostitution, gambling, and labor racketeering that extended across the city. The evidence was extensive, built over years of meticulous investigation, and included testimonies from former associates, financial records, and the fruits of relentless law enforcement surveillance. Yet despite the weight of the case, Luciano approached the trial with calculated composure. He understood that public perception was as important as legal argument, and that projecting confidence, intelligence, and control could influence jurors, the media, and even his adversaries. Every gesture, every word, and every interaction in the courtroom was measured to maintain an aura of authority and invulnerability. The drama of the trial extended beyond facts and legalities. It was a theater of morality, loyalty, and betrayal. Witnesses, some coerced and others motivated by self-preservation, painted vivid portraits of Luciano's operations, exposing the inner workings of his empire to the world. Allegiances were tested, and the psychological tension was palpable. Each revelation, each accusation, had the potential to destabilize the carefully constructed perception of Luciano as both intelligent and untouchable. In this environment, the trial became not just a contest of law, but a battle over narrative, reputation, and the very meaning of power in the criminal underworld. Luciano's legal team, recognizing the stakes, pursued a strategy that balanced technical defense with subtle manipulation of public sentiment. They sought to frame Luciano as a businessman rather than a violent criminal, emphasizing organizational efficiency, lack of direct involvement in violent acts, and the complexity of his operations. By presenting him as a strategic thinker rather than a ruthless killer, they attempted to mitigate both legal and moral culpability in the eyes of the jury. It was a sophisticated approach, reflecting an understanding of not just law, but of human perception, narrative framing, and the psychology of judgment, elements that Luciano himself had mastered in the streets. The courtroom became a stage for high-stakes psychological warfare. Prosecutors sought to provoke reactions, elicit admissions, and paint Luciano as morally corrupt, while defense attorneys aimed to maintain composure, control the narrative, and redirect attention to procedural and evidentiary weaknesses. Luciano, ever the strategist, remained poised, analyzing every interaction, gauging reactions, and subtly reinforcing his reputation as a man who understood the rules of both law and human behavior. The trial was a microcosm of the power dynamics that had defined his life, perception, influence, and the careful orchestration of outcomes. Media coverage amplified the stakes of every decision, creating pressure on all sides. Journalists sensationalized testimonies, framed narratives of villainy and genius, and transformed the courtroom into a theater of public fascination. Luciano's name was everywhere, on front pages, in headlines, and whispered in cafes and parlors across the city. This public scrutiny created an additional layer of complexity, as allies and rivals alike interpreted every action and statement, weighing their loyalties and calculating their next moves. In this way, the trial extended far beyond the courtroom, influencing the broader underworld and the networks upon which Luciano relied. The trial also exposed the tension between morality and pragmatism in organized crime. While Luciano's operations had been ruthless and often exploitative, his strategic intelligence, charisma, and ability to maintain order within a chaotic environment complicated the moral narrative. Observers, whether in court or in the press, grappled with the paradox of a man capable of extraordinary organizational genius, yet operating in defiance of law and societal norms. This tension heightened the dramatic stakes, framing Luciano not merely as a criminal, but as a complex figure whose actions forced society to confront uncomfortable questions about power, loyalty, and human ambition. As proceedings unfolded, it became clear that the outcome would have implications far beyond Luciano himself. A conviction could destabilize his empire, embolden rivals, and signal a shift in law enforcement's approach to organized crime. Conversely, an acquittal or mitigation could reinforce his authority and extend his influence. For Luciano, the trial was therefore a strategic contest as much as a legal one, an arena in which intellect, perception, and psychological mastery were as important as statutes and testimony. Ultimately, the trial culminated in a conviction that sent Luciano to prison, marking a dramatic turning point in his life and career. Yet even in defeat, he demonstrated remarkable resilience and foresight. While physically constrained, his influence over operations remained, his network endured, and his reputation, carefully cultivated over years of strategic action, continued to command fear and respect. The courtroom may have imposed legal limitations, but it could not erase the psychological and organizational dominance he had established. The trial of Lucky Luciano stands as a defining moment in the history of organized crime, highlighting the interplay between law, perception, and strategic intelligence. It underscored the fragility and resilience of power, revealing both the vulnerabilities inherent in visibility and the enduring influence of psychological mastery. Through composure, tactical insight, and an understanding of human behavior, Luciano navigated this crucible in a way that reinforced his legacy, a man who, even under the weight of legal judgment, remained a figure of awe, fear, and strategic brilliance. Even behind the formidable walls of prison, Lucky Luciano's presence and influence remained palpable, a testament to the extraordinary combination of intellect, psychological insight, and strategic acumen that had defined his rise. While incarceration physically removed him from the streets of New York, it did not diminish his capacity to control, manipulate, and orchestrate the operations of his empire. From the moment he entered the correctional system, Luciano approached imprisonment not as a period of helplessness, but as a challenge to be navigated with the same meticulous planning that had propelled him to power. Within these constraints, he demonstrated that true authority is less about physical proximity and more about the ability to influence outcomes, manage perception, and maintain loyalty. Luciano's first priority was maintaining communication with his organization. Despite the scrutiny of prison authorities, he established reliable channels through trusted lieutenants, intermediaries, and even legal representatives, ensuring that directives could be conveyed and implemented with precision. Every message was carefully framed to project authority, reinforce loyalty, and manage operations without revealing vulnerabilities. Luciano understood that perception was as crucial as action. The men under his command needed to believe that their leader remained omnipresent, capable of oversight and judgment, regardless of physical confinement. This psychological projection of power was essential to sustaining cohesion and obedience within the ranks. Within the prison itself, Luciano also demonstrated remarkable social intelligence. He navigated relationships with other inmates, guards, and administrative staff in ways that protected his position and minimized threats. By carefully observing behavior, identifying opportunities for leverage, and exploiting the natural hierarchies of prison life, he ensured both his personal security and his continued ability to influence external operations. These interactions were never casual. Each conversation, gesture, or alliance was calculated to reinforce his authority and maintain channels of information that would serve the broader strategic interests of his criminal enterprise. Control over his outside operations required delegation, and Luciano's organizational acumen was tested to its limits. He relied on a core network of trusted lieutenants to execute his directives, manage revenue streams, and respond to emerging threats. These men were selected not merely for their loyalty, but for their intelligence, discipline, and ability to act autonomously while remaining aligned with Luciano's objectives. By empowering key figures with defined authority and responsibility, he ensured that the organization could function smoothly despite his physical absence. This careful balance of delegation and oversight exemplified his understanding of both human psychology and structural efficiency. Luciano's ability to maintain influence also relied on strategic manipulation of perception. He cultivated the belief that he remained omnipotent, capable of enforcing loyalty and punishing betrayal even from behind bars. Stories of his decisiveness and ruthlessness were circulated intentionally, ensuring that both allies and rivals treated him with respect, fear, or deference. By controlling the narrative of his power, Luciano effectively extended his reach beyond the prison walls, demonstrating that authority is as much about belief and perception as it is about direct action. Legal maneuvering became another tool in Luciano's arsenal. Through his attorneys and carefully orchestrated appeals, he navigated the judicial system with an eye toward both immediate relief and long-term strategy. These legal battles were not only about freedom, they were about preserving influence, protecting assets, and demonstrating to both his followers and adversaries that his reach and cunning extended into every arena of power. Every motion, negotiation, or delay was calculated to serve broader strategic objectives, reinforcing his image as a leader who could operate under extreme pressure without losing control. Psychologically, this period demanded resilience. Luciano faced isolation, scrutiny, and the constant awareness that rivals and law enforcement were watching, waiting for opportunities to exploit weakness. Yet he transformed these pressures into a crucible for strategic thinking. He observed human behavior, identified patterns of loyalty and defection, and used this knowledge to reinforce internal cohesion. By doing so, he turned imprisonment into a laboratory for leadership, refining the methods that would allow him to maintain power despite formidable constraints. Luciano's influence was also reinforced by selective acts of intimidation and reward, carefully orchestrated through intermediaries. Loyal associates were recognized and compensated, reinforcing obedience and commitment, while potential threats were neutralized subtly, often without direct involvement. This approach mirrored his street-level tactics, strategic, efficient, and psychologically attuned. Even in confinement, he demonstrated that control could be exercised through indirect channels when executed with precision and foresight. The broader criminal ecosystem also adapted to Luciano's ongoing presence behind bars. Rivals and law enforcement alike recognized that his imprisonment did not equate to weakness. Allies continued to honor agreements, competitors hesitated to challenge operations, and the structural integrity of his empire remained intact. Luciano had effectively translated his mastery of human behavior and organizational control from the streets into the constrained environment of the prison, proving that leadership transcends physical limitations when paired with intellect, strategy, and psychological acuity. By the time his incarceration had progressed, Luciano's influence had not only survived but evolved. He had established a precedent for the continuity of leadership in organized crime, demonstrating that a truly strategic mind could project authority beyond physical confines. His ability to maintain cohesion, manage operations, and manipulate perception from prison solidified his reputation as a figure whose power was both enduring and adaptable. Ultimately, power behind bars was not merely about control in a literal sense, but about the demonstration of psychological dominance, organizational mastery, and strategic foresight. Luciano's imprisonment underscored the depth of his understanding of human behavior, loyalty, and fear, proving that leadership, when executed with intellect, discipline, and precision, can persist even in the most restrictive circumstances. In this chapter of his life, Luciano transformed a potential vulnerability into a platform for continued influence, reinforcing the notion that true power is measured not by freedom of movement, but by the ability to command, manipulate, and inspire from any position of constraint. By the early 1940s, Lucky Luciano's empire, though intact, was under increasing pressure from law enforcement, wartime politics, and international scrutiny. His influence over New York's underworld remained formidable, but his personal freedom was severely constrained by the sentence he had received for his criminal enterprises. It was during this period that the contours of his final chapter began to emerge, one defined by deportation, strategic maneuvering, and a reflection on a life spent navigating the treacherous balance of power, loyalty, and morality. Luciano's deportation was not merely a logistical relocation, it was a calculated decision by authorities to remove a master strategist from the streets of New York while attempting to disrupt the continuity of organized crime. Yet, even as he was physically uprooted, Luciano approached this exile with the same tactical mind that had defined his ascent. The circumstances surrounding his deportation were intertwined with broader geopolitical dynamics. During World War II, the U.S. government recognized Luciano's potential utility in safeguarding ports, protecting shipping routes, and leveraging contacts within the Italian-American community. Through clandestine negotiations, authorities effectively brokered a deal. In exchange for his cooperation, Luciano's sentence would be commuted, but he would be deported to Italy. This arrangement illustrated the paradoxical interplay of power, morality, and pragmatism that characterized much of Luciano's life, a criminal mastermind simultaneously constrained and leveraged by the state, navigating opportunities even in the shadow of punishment. Relocating to Italy represented both a physical and psychological shift. No longer at the helm of his New York empire, Luciano faced the challenge of maintaining influence from afar while adapting to a new cultural and political environment. Italy, under the post-war Reconstruction era, offered both opportunities and limitations. Luciano quickly recognized the potential for continuing operations through intermediaries, leveraging long-standing relationships, and cultivating new alliances that could extend his reach across international borders. His understanding of human behavior, loyalty, and organizational dynamics allowed him to adapt, ensuring that exile did not equate to irrelevance. Despite the constraints of deportation, Luciano remained deeply involved in the strategic oversight of his former empire. Communications flowed through trusted lieutenants who managed day-to-day operations, executed directives, and maintained discipline across his networks. Luciano's role shifted from hands-on management to high-level orchestration, focusing on the alignment of objectives, mitigation of internal disputes, and preservation of revenue streams. By positioning himself as a distant but decisive authority, he maintained the psychological leverage that had always been central to his leadership. Allies continued to respect and fear his judgment, while rivals recognized that distance did not diminish the consequences of defiance. Exile also offered Luciano the space for reflection. Removed from the immediacy of street-level violence and the pressures of daily operational control, he confronted the broader implications of his life choices, the consequences of his actions, and the legacy he would leave behind. Interviews, personal reflections, and interactions with those in his orbit reveal a man aware of his own complexity, simultaneously a visionary, a strategist, and a figure whose methods had often relied on ruthlessness and manipulation. In Italy, Luciano had the opportunity to reconcile the myth of the untouchable Don with the reality of a man navigating mortality, loss, and the limits of control. During these final years, Luciano's understanding of the interplay between legality, morality, and pragmatism became increasingly nuanced. He observed the shifting political landscape of post-war Italy, the evolving strategies of law enforcement, and the internal dynamics of his own networks. By analyzing these changes, he adapted his approach, demonstrating that his strategic genius was not limited to the streets of New York but could be applied across borders and contexts. His ability to anticipate challenges, manage human behavior, and exercise influence remotely underscored the enduring sophistication of his methods. Yet exile was not without its frustrations. Luciano had been accustomed to direct control, immediate feedback, and the visceral sense of power that comes from operating at the center of an empire. The distance imposed by deportation required patience, restraint, and reliance on intermediaries, testing his ability to maintain authority without physical presence. This period demanded a recalibration of leadership style, one that emphasized diplomacy, communication, and psychological projection over the direct, hands-on management that had characterized his earlier years. Socially and politically, Luciano also had to navigate the complexities of Italian society. He engaged with former contacts, built alliances with emerging figures, and carefully monitored developments that could affect his interests. His network became a hybrid of old loyalties and new opportunities, blending remnants of his New York operations with connections cultivated in Europe. In doing so, Luciano demonstrated a remarkable adaptability, transforming exile from a potential endpoint into a stage for continued influence and strategic maneuvering. Philosophically, this period prompted contemplation of legacy and mortality. Luciano confronted the duality of his existence, a man feared and respected, yet constrained by forces beyond his control, a figure capable of extraordinary organization and strategy, yet subject to the whims of law and circumstance. These reflections shaped his approach to alliances, negotiations, and even personal conduct, reflecting a maturation in his understanding of power, one that extended beyond immediate gain to consider sustainability, perception, and the long-term consequences of action. Ultimately, the exile and endgame of Lucky Luciano's life illustrated the enduring tension between freedom and constraint, influence and limitation, strategy and circumstance. While physically removed from the streets that had defined his empire, Luciano's intellect, foresight, and understanding of human behavior allowed him to maintain relevance, orchestrate outcomes, and shape the perception of his power. His deportation was not a simple downfall but a transition, a shift in the theater of operations that demanded adaptation, resilience, and continued strategic mastery. Through these final years, Luciano's life became a study in the resilience of influence and the psychology of leadership. He demonstrated that true power is not solely a function of proximity or physical control, but of the ability to manage perception, loyalty, and behavior across space, time, and circumstance. Even in exile, the shadow of his authority loomed large, a testament to the skill, intellect, and strategic vision that had allowed him to rise, dominate, and endure in the volatile world of organized crime. Lucky Luciano's legacy is a complex tapestry of innovation, power, and psychological mastery, a blueprint that reshaped organized crime both in America and across the globe. His influence extended far beyond the streets of New York, leaving an indelible mark on the structure, strategy, and culture of criminal organizations for decades to come. Unlike predecessors who relied primarily on fear and brute force, Luciano understood that the sustainability of power required organization, foresight, and the manipulation of human behavior. He transformed the mafia from a collection of loosely affiliated street gangs into a disciplined, hierarchical, and profit-driven enterprise, a model that would inspire generations of criminals and intrigue historians, law enforcement, and the public alike. At the core of his legacy was the creation of a business-oriented approach to crime. Luciano implemented systems that mirrored corporate structures, defined roles, clear chains of command, accountability mechanisms, and revenue tracking. Every operation, from bootlegging and gambling to prostitution and labor racketeering, was organized with meticulous attention to efficiency, control, and scalability. This approach not only maximized profit but also minimized risk, creating a sustainable model that outlasted individual players and rival factions. By applying principles of management, delegation, and strategy to illicit enterprises, Luciano demonstrated that criminal organizations could operate with precision comparable to legitimate businesses. The establishment of the Commission was perhaps Luciano's most enduring contribution. By creating a governing body that mediated disputes, coordinated territories, and regulated operations among the various mafia families, he introduced a system designed to reduce infighting and maintain stability. This innovation addressed one of the central vulnerabilities of organized crime, fragmentation and internecine warfare. Through the Commission, Luciano institutionalized negotiation, arbitration, and strategic collaboration, creating a mechanism that allowed competing factions to coexist while preserving individual and collective profitability. The Commission became a central feature of the American Mafia, a structure that not only reinforced his authority but also ensured the long-term resilience of organized crime. Luciano's psychological insight was equally central to his enduring influence. He understood that power was as much about perception as it was about action. Loyalty, fear, respect, and reputation were tools that could be leveraged as effectively as any weapon. By carefully cultivating his image, both as a visionary strategist and a ruthless enforcer, he maintained control over allies and rivals alike. Men followed him not only out of fear of reprisal but because they recognized his intellect, his foresight, and his ability to orchestrate outcomes with precision. This mastery of human psychology became a hallmark of his leadership, influencing not only his contemporaries but also future generations of criminal leaders who sought to emulate his methods. Globally, Luciano's method set a precedent for organized crime that transcended national borders. His approach to coordination, delegation, and strategic management became a model for criminal enterprises in other countries, influencing the development of syndicates in Italy, the Caribbean, and beyond. The principles he established, discipline, strategic thinking, and psychological leverage, became the bedrock upon which modern organized crime was built, demonstrating that innovation in this realm was not merely tactical but systemic. Luciano's influence also extended into the realm of public perception and cultural mythology. Through newspapers, trials, and the fascination of popular media, his image became larger than life, a figure both feared and admired, a symbol of audacity, intelligence, and control. This mythologizing of his persona amplified his psychological dominance, ensuring that even those outside his immediate sphere of influence perceived him as a figure of power whose reach and intellect could not easily be challenged. The legend of Lucky Luciano thus reinforced the practical effects of his leadership, extending the impact of his strategies beyond the operational to the symbolic. Yet his legacy is not without moral ambiguity. Luciano's enterprises were rooted in exploitation, violence, and the subversion of law and societal norms. The same systems that generated extraordinary efficiency and control also perpetuated human suffering, corruption, and social instability. This duality, the coexistence of brilliance and ruthlessness, strategy and immorality, makes his life a compelling study in the complexities of leadership, power, and human behavior. Scholars, law enforcement professionals, and cultural commentators continue to grapple with this tension, recognizing that his genius was inseparable from the ethical compromises it entailed. Historically, Luciano's innovations reshaped law enforcement strategies as well. His systematized approach to crime forced authorities to adapt, prioritize intelligence gathering, and develop coordinated responses that mirrored the organization and foresight he had applied to illicit operations. In this way, his legacy extends beyond the criminal world, influencing policing, criminology, and the study of organized crime as a discipline. The challenges he posed catalyzed developments in legal frameworks, investigative methodologies, and interagency collaboration, demonstrating that the impact of his strategies was both practical and far-reaching. Luciano's life and work also provide enduring psychological lessons. He exemplifies the interplay of ambition, intellect, and human insight, a figure who leveraged understanding of behavior, perception, and loyalty to achieve dominance. His ability to anticipate reactions, manipulate perception, and structure systems for long-term control offers lessons not only for those studying criminal networks but also for anyone interested in leadership, strategy, and influence. These insights into human behavior, while forged in the context of crime, have broader applicability in understanding power dynamics across a variety of social and organizational environments. Ultimately, Lucky Luciano's legacy is one of transformation, of crime into strategy, chaos into organization, and influence into a system that endured beyond his personal presence. He demonstrated that leadership is not merely about strength or fear, but about vision, intellect, and the capacity to orchestrate human behavior with precision. The structures he built, the psychological principles he employed, and the mythos he cultivated combined to create a lasting imprint on both the criminal world and the broader understanding of power, strategy, and human behavior. Luciano's story serves as a lens through which we can examine the complex interplay of morality, intelligence, and influence. It forces reflection on the paradoxes of power, how brilliance can coexist with ruthlessness, how control can emerge from chaos, and how human systems, even those operating outside the law, can be engineered with foresight and discipline. His legacy endures not merely because of his deeds, but because of the systems, strategies, and psychological insights that continue to inform the operation and study of organized crime worldwide. In this sense, Lucky Luciano transcends the traditional notion of a criminal figure. He becomes a case study in strategy, psychology, and leadership, a man whose methods and vision shaped an era and whose influence persists long after his death. Respect, fear, and fascination remain entwined with his name, reflecting the enduring power of a life defined by audacity, intelligence, and an unparalleled understanding of the human condition. The story of Lucky Luciano closes with a reflection on power, legacy, and the paradoxes of a life lived in the shadows of both law and morality. From the streets of Manhattan to the heights of organized crime, Luciano's life was defined by contrasts, brilliance and ruthlessness, loyalty and betrayal, control and vulnerability. Even in exile, stripped of direct authority over his empire, he maintained influence through careful orchestration, psychological insight, and strategic delegation. His ability to manipulate perception and command loyalty ensured that distance could not diminish his presence. Luciano's legacy lies in his transformation of organized crime into a disciplined, profit-driven enterprise. He introduced structure, hierarchy, and strategic oversight where chaos had once prevailed, creating systems that endured long after his physical absence. The establishment of the Commission reflected his vision for cooperation among factions, reducing infighting while maximizing power and profitability. Beyond operations, his mastery of human behavior, understanding fear, respect, and loyalty, became a blueprint for leadership in both illicit and legitimate spheres. Yet his life also underscores the moral ambiguities inherent in power. Success was inseparable from exploitation, violence, and the subversion of law. The man and the myth coexist in the cultural imagination, Luciano as the ruthless Don, the brilliant strategist, the untouchable figure whose methods continue to influence criminal networks worldwide. His story reminds us that true power is as much about perception and influence as it is about control. Ultimately, Lucky Luciano's name still commands respect and fear because of the intelligence, audacity, and psychological mastery that shaped his life. The myth amplifies the man, and the man validates the myth. His life is a study in ambition, strategy, and human complexity, a cautionary tale, a blueprint, and a legend that endures, long after the streets he once ruled have fallen silent.